Chapter 683. Time passed, minute by minute, second by second. Every second was unbearable for Tang Yu. His heart ached. His Chi-Chi was so afraid of pain. She was even afraid of blood. Now that she had lost so much blood, was she afraid? His eyes were a little red. He touched his pocket for a long time before remembering that he had quit smoking a long time ago. Tang Ziyuan handed him a cigarette. Go and have a smoke. Tang Yu lit it and took a long drag. It seemed that he could calm down by doing this. After 2 long hours, the door of the operating room finally opened. Although Dr. May was tired, she walked quickly. Tang Yu immediately went up to her. He pursed his beautiful thin lips, but he couldn't ask. Mother and child are safe. Thank goodness. Dr. May took off her mask and smiled tiredly. At that moment, Tang Yu felt his body relax and the soles of his feet soften. Lin Yun was a woman after all, so she could make up her mind. Shui Xian, sorry to trouble you. When Chi-Chi wakes up, we'll go and see her. She turned her body and kicked Tang Yu. Are you stupid? Tang Yu woke up and said in a dry voice, Aunt May, thank you. What are you thanking me for? Chi-Chi is still very weak. Although the child is safe, she might have to be hospitalized for the first 6 months. She will have to be extra careful after that. The first child is always more precious. Dr. May put on her mask again. I'll go in first. I'm afraid that Tang Yu will be too worried. The door closed again. Tang Yu's eyes were slightly wet. Lin Yun glanced at him. Look at you. You're so calm in the face of danger, but now you're almost crying in the hospital. Although that was what she said, she still hugged him. How could she not know how Tang Yu felt? Back then, she had also lost a child. She thought that she would never be able to have another child, but she didn't expect, just now, Pei Chi-Chi's unborn child might not be able to survive. In her mind, there was only worry, and not a trace of Zhao Ku. She thought that it was Tang Yu and Zhao Yi who made her let go of everything, and of course, the child in her belly. Lin Yun hugged Tang Yu softly. Tang Yu, you're going to be a big brother again. Even Tang Yu was stunned. He looked at his mother and didn't know what to feel. I think you've long passed the rebellious phase, so you won't mind too much. Lin Yun smiled and patted him. The incomparably noble Tang Yu was in an especially sorry state today. He was still a bit dazed, and it took him a long time to come back to his senses. He smiled bitterly and said, of course. Zhao Yi was smiling from the side. When Lin Yun returned to his side, he helped her sit down, extremely considerate. Just like that, Tang Ziyuan could only watch his Yun with another man. When they got married, he did not go. He was not generous enough to see her remarry while he still loved her. He didn't even know how many times he had drunkenly called her name. But she belonged to another man. Zhao Yi was a very considerate man. After weighing the pros and cons, he said to his wife gently, Yun, I'm going to buy some things from the supermarket across the street. Chi-Chi will need them when she comes out later. Tang Yu probably didn't expect this at the moment. Sit down, I'll be there in a while. Chapter 684. Zhao Yi got up and patted Tang Yu. Take care of your mother too. Tang Yu understood and nodded. Grandpa Tang knew that everything was fine and went back. After Zhao Yi left, Tang Ziyuan slowly walked over and sat next to Lin Yun. After a while, he glanced at his charming ex-wife, touched his nose, and asked unhappily, You're pregnant? Lin Yun was a little surprised. She didn't expect Tang Ziyuan to see it. Yun, you were like this when you were pregnant with Tang Yu. How could I not see it? Tang Ziyuan smiled. He wanted to smoke but put it down because he was worried about Lin Yun. Lin Yun was speechless. If that was the case, how could he not see it when she was pregnant with that child? Lin Yun was a little emotional, but it was only a little. It had been so many years. Tang Ziyuan was snubbed. He gave Lin Yun a deep look and didn't say anything else. After a while, Zhao Yi came back with a big bag of daily necessities. Pei Chi-Chi was pushed to the VIP ward. She still hadn't woken up. Lin Yun stood at the door and told Tang Yu something before leaving. Tang Ziyuan watched the couple leave and stood there for a long time. Then he patted Tang Yu's shoulder and said, "Take good care of her." Tang Yu nodded, "Don't tell Tang Xian yet." He didn't want Tang Xian to worry and also didn't want her to disturb Pei Chi-Chi. After Tang Ziyuan left, Tang Yu closed the door and sat in front of the bed. Pei Chi-Chi's eyes were closed. Her long and thick eyelashes were like two small fans on her face, which made her face look even paler. Tang Yu sat on the bed and reached out to brush away the hair on her forehead. He said in a hoarse voice, "Chi-Chi." Her eyelashes trembled, but she still didn't wake up. Her little hand that was held by him was weak. His heart ached. She was as fragile as a child at this time. He bent down and hugged her, and the child very carefully. Dr. May had already changed out of her surgical gown and stood at the door with two nurses behind her. Dr. May's face was gentle. She had watched Tang Yu grow up. She had never seen him as fragile as he was now. The nurse glanced at Dr. May and said in a low voice, "She should be on an 4 drip." Dr. May made a sound of acknowledgement and walked in to personally help Pei Chi-Chi with the drip. From today until tomorrow, he'll need a drip. He'll be much better after tomorrow afternoon. Dr. May paused for a moment. "Don't worry, this won't affect the child." She signaled the nurse to leave with her eyes. Then, she coughed lightly and said, "Don't have sex for 3 months." Tang Yu was a little surprised and looked at Dr. May. Dr. May put her hands inside her white coat and coughed again. "That's all. I'm going to have lunch first." Chi-Chi would wake up in about 2 hours. At that time, he could eat liquid food appropriately. Tang Yu watched her leave and sat for a while before wringing a hot towel to wipe Pei Chi-Chi's hands and face. Pei Chi-Chi didn't wake up until 2:00 in the afternoon. When she slowly opened her eyes, she saw Tang Yu's slightly haggard face. He sat by the bed and leaned forward. His eyes were fixed on her. She tried hard to open her eyes and looked at him quietly. She gently moved her fingers and slowly caught one of his index fingers. Her little face was still pale as she held it. "Tang Yu, the child," she stared at him with her eyes that were like black grapes. She was afraid that she would miss a trace of his expression. Tang Yu felt sorry for her. He held her little hand tightly. "Chi-Chi, the child is fine." Chapter 685. Tang Yu stepped forward and hugged her carefully. His warm breath enveloped her body. "Chi-Chi, our child is still here." His voice and body were trembling. He closed his eyes and said, "I'm sorry. It was because he didn't take good care of her that she almost lost her child." Pei Chi-Chi didn't move. She could feel his cautiousness and trembling. This was Tang Yu. How could he be so scared? The two of them didn't say anything and just hugged each other. At this moment, they both needed to feel each other's warmth. After a long time, he maintained this posture and said in a hoarse voice, "Chi-Chi, are you hungry?" She nodded and looked around. Her eyes fell on his face again. "Tang Yu, did you not have lunch?" He didn't say anything. He got up and went to get a small bowl of millet porridge. He then shook her bed and fed her. She was still weak, so he held her head with one hand and fed her with the other. Pei Chi-Chi rested her head on his shoulder. Her eyes were filled with his light blue shirt, which made her feel at ease. She cried out obediently and recovered some strength. His little hand gently stroked his lower abdomen. This child was really tenacious. She looked up at Tang Yu and said, "You eat some." Tang Yu finished the rest of her porridge, quickly packed up and accompanied her. He still had some lingering fear, but he didn't want to bring this negative emotion to her, so he didn't mention it. He didn't mention it, but Pei Chi did. "Do you really think it was done by Pei Huan's fans?" Tang Yu reached out to wipe the sweat on her forehead and said hoarsely, "Don't you think so? Would Pei Huan have such loyal fans?" Pei Chi looked at Tang Yu. "Have you guessed who did it?" He held her fingers, and there was an indescribable pain in his heart. Pei Chi looked at him and didn't say anything else. She knew how he felt, and this kind of thing needed evidence. She couldn't be convicted based on guesses. Her body was weak, and after a short conversation, she fell asleep in exhaustion. Tang Yu kept watching until evening. Meng Qingqing came over, but he didn't come in. Tang Yu covered Pei Chi with the quilt, walked out and closed the door carefully. "How is the girl?" Tang Yu asked. Meng Qingqing took out a cigarette and gave it to Tang Yu, but Tang Yu didn't take it and looked at him. Meng Qingqing scratched his head and coughed. "Tang Yu, you. Be ready." Tang Yu's brows furrowed slightly as he listened to Meng Qingqing quickly say, "After coming out of the hospital's operating theater, the girl jumped off the building. It was probably because she was disfigured." Tang Yu's gaze looked straight into Meng Qingqing's eyes. Meng Qingqing smiled bitterly. Tang Yu said slowly, "Or maybe, it's because of the person behind her." As he said this, Meng Qingqing was speechless. After a long time, he sighed. "I didn't expect it." Tang Yu's face was a little tense and he put his hand in his pocket. "Qingqing, do you have a cigarette?" Chapter 686. Meng Qingqing nodded and suddenly asked, "Tang Yu, if we find out that she did it, what will you do?" "Send her to jail." Tang Yu's gaze was calm. Although he didn't say a word, Meng Qingqing already understood what he meant. He paused and said, "With Shen Zhongshan's current situation, only Shen Lian can support Jin Taihe." Tang Yu's black eyes were cold. "What does this have to do with me?" "If she did it, then Shen Lian would have to pay the price." Meng Qingqing nodded. "Okay, if necessary, I will look for King to see if there are any relevant clues." However, what they thought, the person behind it also thought. All the clues were clean, and the source of the call on the phone of the girl who jumped off the building couldn't be found. The director of a bureau in B City personally came to apologize to Tang Yu for his incompetence. Tang Yu met him outside. After listening, he silently finished smoking the cigarette in his hand and said lightly, "This matter ends here." He wouldn't be able to find anything if he continued to investigate, and he had his own way. The director of B City wiped the cold sweat off his forehead and left. When Tang Yu returned to the ward, Pei Chi was leaning against the headboard and reading lazily. Seeing him come in, she looked up. "Who's here?" Tang Yu slowly closed the door and paused. "A senior in the company." Pei Chi replied with an "oh," and didn't say anything else. Her gaze was still on the fairy tale book in her hand. Her face was quiet and beautiful, and there was some color in it. Compared to her pale face a week ago, she was a little rounder. Tang Yu walked over and sat down. He reached out to touch her little face and smiled. "How is the child?" Pei Chi put down the book in her hand and looked down at her belly. Then, she smiled. "It's fine." As she said that, she sat up straight and hugged his arm. "Tang Yu, when are we going home?" She was going moldy after living here for a week. Tang Yu turned his head to look at her lively little face. He smiled faintly and asked casually, "Isn't it good to live here?" She frowned. "Oh no. It smells like disinfectant. I don't like it, and neither does the baby." Her little face rested on his shoulder, her black eyes blinking as she stared at him. Just by looking at her, his heart was about to melt. Tang Yu reached out to touch his chin and looked at her. But Auntie May said to stay for at least a month to protect the baby. "Tang Yu, can you tell Auntie May that I'm going home? I promise I won't run around and I'll stay in bed." Her eyes were bright and lively. Tang Yu stared at her and said slowly, "Why should I tell Aunt May?" Pei Chi looked surprised. "Don't you love me very much? Didn't you say that I would agree to everything? You also know that I love you?" He asked and reached out to knock her little head. "Then you shouldn't have made such a request." Pei Chi looked at him. She wasn't afraid of him at all. "Mr. Tang, a kiss." He looked at her. "Mrs. Tang, do you want to get rid of me with a kiss?" As he said that, he reached out and held her in his arms. He was so close that she could also feel his excitement. Shameless. Her little face rested on his shoulder. She was a little shy, and her little hand gently touched the side of his shoulder. Tang Yu kissed her and didn't let go of her, nor did he go further. Chapter 687. But the little mischievous girl kept poking him and hugging his neck. Her voice was especially soft. "Tang Yu, are you feeling terrible?" His face darkened as he stared at her. "Pei Chi, what do you think?" Since she was recuperating, he had no choice but to recuperate. She hugged him and giggled. Tang Yu gently patted her twice and said helplessly, "You're already so old, but you're still like a child." He wanted to tell her to get down, but she clung to him and refused to let go. Chi. He called her name, then brushed aside her crazy little hair, revealing her jade-white face, and kissed her deeply. Her little hands clutched his shirt as she accepted his kiss. His kiss was restrained yet affectionate. His whole body was taut and powerful. Her little hands caressed his back. She was soft in his arms, like a puddle of water. After a long time, he finally let go of her with great difficulty. "Chi, do you want me to kiss you?" His fingers gently caressed her rosy little mouth, letting her nestle in his arms. Just hugging her like this, his heart was incomparably satisfied. She was still a little absent-minded. Her small mouth was slightly open, and her eyes were misty. She was indescribably seductive. Tang Yu was so aroused that he could not help but kiss her again. It was a lingering kiss, as if he had the rest of his life to kiss her like this. In the end, he was still interrupted. The nurse stood at the door helplessly because Mr. Tang was kissing Mrs. Tang. Mrs. Tang was pressed down on the bed, and Mr. Tang was propped up on top of her. Even though he was wearing a shirt, his muscles could still be seen. It was the kind where they kissed while doing push-ups. How embarrassing. The nurse covered her overheated face and said softly, "Mr. Tang, Miss Pei wants to see Mrs. Tang. She says she's Mrs. Tang's younger sister." Mr. Tang was playing with Mrs. Tang. When he heard the voice, his body stiffened. Then he turned over and frowned. "Sister." Before the nurse could say anything, Pei Huan had already walked out from behind. "It's me." Tang Yu's gaze was profound, and the nurse quickly retreated. When Pei Chi heard the voice, she could tell that it was Pei Huan. She did not expect Pei Huan to come. Tang Yu tilted his head and asked gently, "Do you want to see him?" "Let's meet." Pei Chi sat down and tidied her hair. Pei Huan walked in and saw the messy bed. She roughly knew what they had been doing. Pei Huan chuckled twice and said with a fake smile, "You look like you're in a good mood. Did I interrupt something?" Tang Yu only glanced at her, and she shut up, not daring to mention it again. Pei Chi leaned against the headboard and didn't exchange pleasantries with Pei Huan. She asked directly, "What brings you here?" Pei Huan did not say yes, nor did she say no. She looked at Pei Chi up and down. Her complexion was good, and she was still in the mood to play just now. The child was still there. "Nothing. I just came to see how you are." Pei Huan walked to the sofa opposite the bed and sat down. After sitting for a while, she smiled. "This sofa is really nice. And this ward is even bigger and more luxurious than the apartment." Pei Chi kept looking at her without saying anything, waiting for Pei Huan to get to the point. She could tell that Pei Huan was bluffing. Usually, people who dealt with bad things would act like this. Pei Huan took out a cigarette from her bag. She was about to smoke, but then she put it back. Chapter 689. Tang Yu rubbed her fluffy hair and sighed. Our Chi-Chi's heart softened after she got pregnant. It's not that. She raised her head and hugged his waist. Tang Yu, haven't you noticed that Pei Huan has changed? Although his attitude was almost as bad as before, Pei Chi and Pei Huan had grown up together. How could she not feel Pei Huan's change? Mr. Tang's answer was, "I don't pay attention to her." Pei Chi looked at him. Tang Yu smiled. "Mrs. Tang, it's time for nap." He gently held her under the quilt and kissed her forehead. "The baby needs to sleep too." Pei Chi grabbed his arm. It was rare for her to be disobedient. "You haven't agreed to what we just talked about." And he had kissed her. Mr. Tang immediately put on a superior attitude and looked at her. "Pei Chi, when did I agree?" Pei Chi was furious. She grabbed his hand and bit it. "Then why did you kiss me?" He let her bite his hand. When she left a bite mark, he chuckled and said, "Mrs. Tang, should I let you kiss me back?" Profiteer. Pei Chi let go of him and rolled to the other side with the blanket. Looking from the back, they were all angry. But she was so cute when she was angry. Tang Yu smiled and covered her with the blanket. He turned over to the sofa and turned on his laptop. These days, he had been dealing with business in the hospital. When Chi was asleep, he would take time to read documents. She said that she wanted to move back. He wanted her to live more comfortably, but he didn't dare to take risks. He was afraid that something would go wrong. Although it was a little annoying to coax her like this, Tang Yu also enjoyed it. Later on, when her body became stronger, he pushed her around the hospital. Of course, at this moment, Tang Yu hired 4 bodyguards. They were all very skilled. Once they left the room, they would follow Pei Chi around the clock, especially when he was occasionally not around. Pei Chi thought he was making a mountain out of a molehill, but Tang Yu didn't want her to know how panicked he was when he saw the blood on her dress. He was afraid of losing her, and he was afraid of losing the baby. He couldn't take another scare like this. In the afternoon, after Pei Chi took a nap, Tang Yu took her for a walk on the lawn outside. He had just received a call. About 10 steps away, Pei Chi was sitting on a lounge chair, looking at the artificial lake across from her. With 4 bodyguards by her side, Pei Chi only felt that it was a dark mass, and all the scenery was tasteless. From afar, she saw 2 nurses pushing Shen Zhongshan over. Pei Chi watched them quietly until they were in front of her. Is he still the same? There's no improvement at all. Pei Chi asked softly. The nurse nodded. Yes, he's still the same. The nurse was nice to Shen Zhongshan. She squatted down and coaxed him. Shen Zhongshan's gaze was fixed on Pei Chi, and he squeezed out a stiff voice, "Little sister." Pei Chi's heart was in a mess. "Mrs. Tang, please don't mind him. Mr. Shen is like this now." The nurse sighed. He's like an old child. Pei Chi replied casually, but her eyes fell on Shin Zhongshan's neck. There was a faint bruise there. She looked at it, and the nurse also looked over. Then, her expression became a little strange. What's going on? Pei Chi looked at the two nurses. They didn't seem to be cruel people. Chapter 690. The nurse hesitated for a long time. After all, Pei Chi was Mrs. Tang, and Xingyuan Hospital belonged to Xingyuan Group. She thought for a while and told the truth. Actually, Miss Shen lost control and pinched me. Miss Shen looked so elegant, but she was so violent behind the scenes. It had happened a few times. She was normal when she came, but after she came, she had a weird expression on her face. They didn't dare to say anything. After all, it was a family matter. But it would be bad if something happened in the hospital. Pei Chi was also stunned. She looked up at Tang Yu. Tang Yu's face was cold. He stood straight, as if he didn't find it strange. Pei Chi looked at Shin Zhongshan again. She touched the bruise with her finger, feeling sad. What kind of conflict did he have to hurt her father? Does it still hurt? She asked Shin Zhongshan softly. But Shin Zhongshan didn't know. He repeated it as usual. Mississippi, Pei Chi's eyes were a little wet. She had seen the man in front of her several times. He was unfamiliar and distant. She didn't expect that one day, they would meet in such a way. She nodded. Miss, let me treat you to some delicious ice cream, okay? In their eyes, Shin Zhongshan was pitiful and pitiful. But maybe he was happy in his own world. If he couldn't be happy, then he didn't know about those ugly things. What was wrong with staying in his own world? Pei Chi would rather not disturb him. Shin Zhongshan stared at her little face. After a long time, he clapped his hands. Eat, then, a string of saliva dripped from the corner of his mouth. Pei Chi's heart ached. This was Shin Zhongshan, the leading figure of B City. She ordered a bodyguard to buy an ice cream. It didn't need to be too big, but it had to be delicious. Shin Zhongshan was already drooling after he said that. Pei Chi wiped the saliva away for him patiently. But then, another string of saliva dripped down. Be a good boy. Let me wipe it away for you. Pei Chi was full of patience. It was probably because she was going to be a little mother that her whole body exuded love, and her whole person was unbelievably gentle. Tang Yu, who was at the side, finished the call and looked over. He wore a pair of white casual pants with a light blue shirt on top. Neat and tidy, he looked incomparably elegant. Holding his phone, he looked at the most important woman in his life, watching her wipe away Shin Zhongshan's saliva. Somehow, he felt that his Chi was a little different. She had become calm and composed, not as sharp as before. His gaze was gentle. After looking at her for a long time, he raised his eyes and saw Mrs. Shen walking over. Tang Yu greeted her. Mrs. Shen's gaze was a little blank. Something was not right. The young nurse whispered, after Mr. Shen was hospitalized, Mrs. Shen was different from before. Sometimes, she would be absent-minded. It looked like she had suffered a blow. Pei Chi didn't say anything. She looked up at Tang Yu. Tang Yu pulled her over and pulled her body into his embrace, hugging her tightly. Mrs. Shen was squatting, wiping away Shin Zhongshan's sweat carefully and attentively. Pei Chi looked at her with hot eyes and said in a low voice, she must love him very much. Tang Yu sighed in his heart and reached out to touch the little guy in his arms. Sometimes, one-sided love was not enough. Shin Zhongshan didn't love Mrs. Shen. At least, that was what Tang Yu thought. All these years, although Shin Zhongshan wasn't like Tang Ziyuan, he had many affairs. Chapter 691. Mrs. Shen also noticed the bruises on Shen Zhongshan's neck. She stared blankly at him, muttering to herself, "That bastard. That bastard." Tang Yu clenched his fists as he watched Mrs. Shen carefully caress Shen Zhongshan's neck. Then, she took out a box of medicine from her bag and carefully applied it for him. Mrs. Shen knew that Shen Lian had done it. So, what did Shen Zhongshan's sudden dementia have to do with Shen Lian? Tang Yu pursed his lips. Mrs. Shen did not speak to them, as if they did not exist. After a while, she pushed him away. "Tang Yu, aren't you going to ask?" Pei Chi tugged at his sleeve. Tang Yu lowered his head to look at her and smiled faintly. "Mrs. Tang, you don't like me asking about my ex-girlfriend?" "That's different." Pei Chi looked at the back view of Mrs. Shen pushing Shen Zhongshan in the distance and said pitifully, "I feel a little sad when I see it." If Shen Lian had been the one who had splashed her with acid and Shen Zhongshan, then Shen Lian was not far from losing her mind. Tang Yu grunted and said softly, "Chi, we won't be like this. He would take good care of her. Forever, he would only have her." The bodyguard bought the ice cream, but Shen Zhongshan had already left. Pei Chi looked down and then looked up at Tang Yu. "Eat it." Tang Yu refused. "Pei Chi, I'm not a child." Pei Chi insisted. "But sometimes you are a child. For example," she glanced at him. As a man, as Pei Chi's man, Tang Yu immediately understood. There was no one around. He lowered his voice and said, "Chi, are you talking about when I eat you?" Pei Chi blushed and stuffed the ice cream into his hand. "Eat it." Tang Yu took it and felt much better. In fact, his Chi wasn't that dumb. He chased after her and grabbed her hand. His voice was filled with adoration and adoration. "You're walking so fast. You should be more careful." "Oh," she replied and slowed down obediently. Then she bit her lip and said, "Tang Yu, the baby kicked me again." Her brows were furrowed and her watery eyes were brimming with tears. She grabbed his hand again. Her long hair was let loose, and her features were exquisite. She didn't look like a mother at all. Without looking at her belly, she looked like a little girl. Tang Yu's heart softened. He squatted down and put his face on her bulging belly. He felt the little hands and feet wriggling inside. His emotions were a little stirred. Life was really magical. He put his finger on her lower abdomen and greeted the little guy inside with a smile. "Hi, I'm Daddy. Be nice to Mommy and don't bully her. Otherwise, I'll spank your little butt when you come out." Pei Chi played with his black hair with her fingers. "You're so small. How can you understand?" At this moment, Tang Yu was no longer the noble and aloof president of Xingyuan, but her husband. There was no sense of distance between them. Just as he said, he wasn't a god. Tang Yu was just an ordinary man. In front of her, he was just an ordinary, sexy, and charming man. He wasn't omnipotent, but he was really good to her. Chapter 692. He patted her butt. "Naughty." Pei Chi giggled and hugged him tightly. "Tang Yu, how can I be so happy?" Mr. Tang stood up and pinched his little face. He coughed and said, "Miss Pei, I can only say that you slept with the right person." She glared at him. Tang Yu looked at her and said, "Weren't you the one who entered my room? Weren't you the one who touched me and kissed me?" He was putting on a high profile again. Whenever Mr. Tang wanted to bully her, he would show such an expression. Pei Chi had fallen for it before, but now she was being naughty. She hugged him shamelessly and said, "No, it was you who couldn't resist the temptation." She hugged him with her belly between them. It was a little funny. Tang Yu put his finger on it and smiled. When the baby comes out, I'll let you know whether I can resist the temptation or not. Pei Chi could imagine countless scenes just by listening to it, in the bathroom, on the sofa, on the bedroom floor, and even in front of the mirror in the changing room. It was very creepy. She hugged him tightly and said, "No. Then let me seduce our baby, okay?" He said it close to her little ear. After saying that, he found that her ears were red. He rubbed them and smiled. In the afternoon, when Pei Chi was taking a nap, Tang Yu went out for a while. He knew that Mrs. Shen was now living in another house of the Shen family. As for the reason, it was probably the same as what he saw today. The doorbell rang a few times and a servant came to open the door. She didn't seem surprised to see Tang Yu and said that Mrs. Shen had been waiting for a while. Tang Yu walked in and saw Mrs. Shen sitting on the sofa in silence. She looked a little solemn. "Aunt Shen." Tang Yu sat opposite her and the servant poured him a cup of tea. Mrs. Shen looked up. It had only been half a month since they last saw each other, but her face was already full of vicissitudes. Mrs. Shen's voice was calm. "I know what you want to ask, Tang Yu." "I don't know anything, and I won't say anything." Tang Yu looked into Mrs. Shen's eyes and saw a mass of dead ash. There was not a single ray of light, not a single ray of hope. "Aunt Shen." Tang Yu's voice was a little strained. When he was 20 years old, he was facing a group of blonde and blue-eyed foreigners on a high-level international negotiation table. Even then, it wasn't so difficult. Because he could tell what those people wanted. Those people had a vision. But Mrs. Shen did not. In her world, there was only the Shen family and Shen Zhongshan. Now, there was no hope at all. Tang Yu could not convince her. Without Shen Zhongshan, Mrs. Shen would not betray her daughter. Tang Yu felt that he had come to the wrong place. "I will find an American expert for Uncle Shen." He stood up and paused for a moment. "Aunt Shen, Jinrong is awake. I believe that one day, a miracle will happen to Uncle Shen." Mrs. Shen's gaze fell on Tang Yu's face. After a long time, a glimmer of hope flashed in her pair of eyes that had aged a lot. But soon, that glimmer of hope was extinguished. She kept looking at Tang Yu. Tang Yu sighed in his heart. At this moment, his phone rang. Before he could answer, the door opened. It was Shen Lian who appeared at the door. Her expression was flustered and her hair was a little messy. Her gaze swept between Tang Yu and her mother. Chapter 693. Tang Yu lowered his head and looked at the untouched cup of tea on the table. He smiled faintly. "I'm here to see Auntie Shen. You can ask me anything." Shen Lian's voice was a little tense as she looked at Tang Yu. "Let's go out for a cup of coffee." Tang Yu nodded at Mrs. Shen and went out with Shen Lian. When they were outside, Shen Lian couldn't hold it in anymore. She sounded flustered and exasperated. "Tang Yu, why did you get people to spy on me?" No, that was no longer spying on her. It was watching over her. No matter where she went, there would be 8 bodyguards watching over her and following her wherever she went. Other than her house and when she went to the toilet, the 8 of them were inseparable like ghosts. She was going crazy. Tang Yu stood in front of the black sports car and took out a cigarette from his pocket. He was addicted to smoking again recently. He took it out and lit it. "Shen Lian, do you have any evidence that I did it?" Just like how he couldn't find any evidence that she had done anything to Chi and Shen Zhongshan. Shen Lian's eyes narrowed. She glared at him and saw the 8 people around her. She held her head and screamed, "Tang Yu, get them to leave." "Leave." He was still calm and collected, calmly smoking his cigarette. I told you to leave, did you hear me? Shen Lian was panting. She felt like she couldn't breathe. Even when she went to the toilet, there were 8 men guarding outside. They looked at her as if she was a monster. Shen Lian found it difficult to breathe. Even when she turned off the lights at night, she still felt that there were 8 pairs of eyes staring at her in the dark. Her hair stood on end. Tang Yu looked at her and put out the cigarette in his hand. He sneered. Shen Lian, when you were doing this, did it ever cross your mind that he was your father? Maybe the law will punish you, but human nature will. In the dead of night, aren't you afraid? Don't you tremble when you look into his eyes? Shen Lian's pupils contracted. She looked at Tang Yu with a judgmental gaze. What did he know? Did he know everything she had done to Shen Zhongshan, or did he know about Pei Qiqi's parentage? After a long time, she sneered, what makes you think that? Tang Yu didn't say anything. He just opened the car door and left. Shen Lian watched him leave in a daze. She didn't expect him to give up so easily. She chased after his car and screamed crazily, get them out of the way. Tang Yu, do you hear me? However, he drove very fast, and soon, she couldn't see his car anymore. Shen Lian watched from afar as her body slid down. Why? Why do you have to be so heartless to me? She slid down and sat on the ground in her high-end suit. She had no family, no Tang Yu, and even no freedom. What use did she have for that lousy company? Shen Lian's face was filled with tears as she murmured, Tang Yu, all of this is for you. But you. Why don't you want me? What's so good about Pei Qiqi? The 8 men stood behind her, still like phantoms, watching her with cold eyes. They were from the special forces and weren't very sensitive to emotions. Shen Lian suddenly turned around and glared at them. She said fiercely, go away, you bastards, bastards, what right did they have to watch over her like that? Chapter 694. When Tang Yu returned to the hospital, the room was quiet. Pei Qiqi was still asleep, lying on her side on the white hospital bed. Her black hair was spread across the pillow, and her little face was fair and adorable. Tang Yu walked in slowly. His originally dark thoughts were slowly being washed away. Seeing her, all the darkness seemed to have been driven away. He was afraid of losing her, so he had to be sure. Before finding out the truth, the most important thing for him was to protect Qiqi from harm. Moreover, Qiqi had promised not to go to the company and would stay at home to recuperate. Pei Qiqi woke up and opened her eyes. She was still lying down and looking at him. Her voice sounded a little lazy after a nap. What's wrong? You don't look too good. Tang Yu smiled. Our Qiqi knows how to care about people. He leaned against the headboard and she naturally buried her little face in his chest. She stretched out her arms and hugged him, yawning. Tang Yu, I still want to sleep. Tang Yu patted her little head. Qiqi, sleep if you want to. I'll watch over you. After a while, her breathing became even. Tang Yu thought that she had fallen asleep and lowered his head to kiss her. Just then, Pei Qiqi's voice sounded a little muffled. Where did you go just now? He laid down slowly with his forehead against hers and said softly, I went to see Mrs. Shin. She moved out. There was a hidden meaning in his words. Pei Qiqi opened her eyes and looked at him. Tang Yu only wanted her to know what he wanted her to know. As for the rest, he would not tell her if it was not necessary. In her heart, Pei Mingyi was the perfect father, so she always kept that wonderful impression in her heart. Pei Qiqi looked at him for a long time before she said softly, what should we do then? Mrs. Shin doesn't want to say. There's nothing we can do for now. Tang Yu reached out and pushed her hair aside. Qiqi, do you want me to use the same method to deal with Shenlian? She shook her head and buried her face in his chest. How could she? Shenlian was crazy, but she wasn't. Tang Yu held Pei Chi in his arms. What he didn't tell Pei Chi was that the reason why he hadn't really touched Shenlian was because he was suspicious of something. This made him indecisive. But in the end, his decision became the last straw to clutch at. A month later, Pei Chi was released from prison. Her belly was also bigger. When she returned to the rose garden, it was already autumn. The baby was almost 6 months old. After staying in the hospital for a month, her lower abdomen was as round as a balloon. If she had not known beforehand, she would have thought that there were 2 babies inside. Dr. May had revealed that it was a girl. The happiest person in the Tang and Lin families was Old Master Lin. Old Master Lin didn't have any girls in his grandchildren's generation. He was used to seeing rough skin and flesh. Chapter 695. Xingyuan Group and Marvel Genrome Group couldn't be taken over for the time being, so he had to manage it. Tang Yu, do you want to take a break? Pei Chi came over and hugged him from behind, murmuring, look at you. You've lost weight. Are you worried about me, Mrs. Tang? Tang Yu was only wearing a shirt and trousers, sitting in front of the sofa and sorting out the documents he had just signed. He didn't even look up. Pei Shaoqi nodded sincerely and snuggled in his arms again. She leaned over to kiss the corner of his mouth and said in a sweet voice with a hint of jealousy, I heard that President Tang will have a romantic encounter in France this time. How could he not understand what she was referring to? For this trip to Paris, Jean Taiha's representative would also go, which meant that he would be meeting Shenlian in France. Mrs. Tang, do you want to go with me? Tang Yu gently pulled her to the front and directly sat on his lap, hugging her as if she was a baby in the past. However, there were still some obstacles. After all, her belly was not small. I'm not going. Pei Chi-Chi's body was in his arms, her head against his chin, and her voice was very delicate. I won't be the third wheel, Mr. Tang. Naughty. He knocked on her head. Are you sure you don't want to go? I'm not going. Pei Shaoqi said with a strong backbone. Then she put her arms around his neck and kissed the corner of his mouth, murmuring seductively, Mr. Tang, aren't you happy about Mrs. Tang's trust? Tang Yu accepted her soft kisses and let her tease him. His voice was low and husky. Not that happy. She giggled and turned around to sit in his arms. Her little hand hung around his neck. Why aren't you happy? Tang Yu looked down at his little girl and then at the pile of documents. After a long struggle, he finally decided to accompany Mrs. Tang. He reached out to pick her up, walked to the king-sized bed, and carefully put her on it. He leaned over and kissed her, taking her little hand down as he kissed her. Pei Chi-Chi retracted her hand. Tang Yu. Her voice sounded weak and uneasy. She already regretted provoking him. I know, Chi-Chi. I know. He coaxed her. Just one kiss. I just want to kiss you. Their lips and teeth intertwined. His fingers forcefully brought her onto his belt. She bit her lips and glanced at him. That gaze was filled with an indescribable charm. Tang Yu chuckled. He leaned against her and hugged her. He whispered into her ear, Mrs. Tang, should I leave some marks on your territory? Pei Chi-Chi looked at him eagerly. How do I mark it? Then why don't I teach you? The older brother, who was also her husband, taught her naughtily. The child learned it as soon as he learned it, and left a red mark on the old man's neck. Tang Yu looked at himself in the shower and frowned. Then he went back to the bedroom and put his hands in front of him like a superior. Mrs. Tang, is marriage equal? Of course. Pei Chi-Chi misunderstood. She did not feel any sense of crisis. Instead, she smiled and said, "Your money is my money." Tang Yu nodded. "That's right. So, you kissed me all over." "To be fair, I kissed you all over." Pei Chi was stunned. Pei Chi was stunned. Pei Chi covered his face. "Tang Yu, you are so bad." Chapter 696. Everything was done carefully, for fear of hurting her. At first, he was joking. After all, he really wanted to tease her. But after that, everything changed. His breathing became rapid, and so did hers. Her little hand grabbed the bedsheets, and her voice was a little hoarse. "Tang Yu, are you done?" She was really scared and weak. She looked up at him, her eyes wet. Tang Yu kissed her desperately, as if his whole body was on fire. A man who had been intimate for a long time could not be solved by a kiss. But he was still worried about her pregnancy, so he held back no matter how uncomfortable it was. He turned to her side, hugged her, and kissed her ear comfortingly. "Be good. Don't be afraid." But that little person nestled in his chest, and after a while, she became a little restless and carefully crawled into the front of his bathrobe. Tang Yu held back for a while, but he still could not. He grabbed her little hand, and his voice was very hoarse. "Chi, you are playing with fire." She said softly, "I am playing with Mr. Tang." He was amused and angry at the same time. After they got married, she was really not afraid of him anymore. "Chi." He held her little face and looked at her seriously. Pei Chi did not let him look. Her little face nestled in his shoulder, and she bit him little by little. They had been together for more than a year. How could he not feel the change in her? Although he was a little troubled, he still thought of a way to make his Chi happy. Of course, he also forced her to make him happy. When Tang Yu left early in the morning, he did not wake her up. She was a little crazy the night before, and she was still sleeping like a little pig. Tang Yu bent down and reached out to wipe away the saliva at the corner of her mouth. Seriously, she was already so old and was about to be a mother, but she was still drooling. Thinking of this, his eyes were very gentle, and his eyes were full of love. When the noble Mr. Tang went downstairs, he gave a lot of instructions to the little helper at home. Even though he had already said it once, he still patiently repeated it this morning before he was relieved. Actually, how could he really be relieved? Xiao Ran was already waiting. She was not going this time. She was only here to pick up the documents. Tang Yu gave the documents to her, and then he took the car to the airport. On the private plane, Tang Yu was still facing a pile of documents, and he was still not paying attention. Meng Qingqing came with him. "Are you still thinking about Pei Chi?" Tang Yu glanced at him. "Mrs. Tang." Meng Qingqing touched his nose. "I'm used to it. But if you're not pregnant, Pei Chi really looks a little young. Standing next to you, you really feel like you're eating tender grass. Qingqing, no one will think you're a mute even if you don't speak." Tang Yu flipped open the document and took a sip of the coffee beside him. Meng Qingqing was sitting opposite him. After thinking about it, he couldn't help but say, "I received news that Shen Lian is also staying at the Hilton Hotel, and," he smiled meaningfully, "she is staying in the CEO's suite next to yours. Tang Yu, you can catch up." Tang Yu knew about this, but he did not take it seriously. If a man didn't think about other things, just like when Pei Huan ran into his room to take a bath, he didn't seem to be moved at all. He didn't have any physiological feelings either. Therefore, there was no need for Shen Lian to be like this. Tang Yu did not respond, and Meng Qingqing suddenly felt a little bored. He got up and said, "Tang Yu, it is difficult to find some gossip and entertainment from you." Chapter 697. Tang Yu ignored him and continued to deal with his own business. After a while, he raised his hand to look at his watch and used the satellite phone to call Pei Chi-Chi's number. It was nothing more than some common life knowledge, causing Meng Qingqing to be stunned. When Tang Yu put down the phone, Meng Qingqing swallowed hard. Tang Yu, your Pei Chi-Chi used to be able to take care of herself, right? Why was it that after marrying Tang Yu had to teach her the common knowledge of brushing her teeth every day? Tang Yu put down the phone slowly and glanced at Meng Qingqing. Then, he said slowly, Qingqing, you're not married and you're not going to be a father. You don't understand. Meng Qingqing couldn't take it anymore. He asked the truth, Tang Yu, you're Pei Chi-Chi's father, right? Although he was only 6 years older, Tang Yu was precocious. He was full of the aura of a mature elite. Perhaps he had a special fatherly love at home, that must be it. Look at him. He kept saying good girl and don't forget this and don't forget that. He was just like his mother, spoiling Pei Chi-Chi like a child. Meng Qingqing pounded his chest and stamped his feet. Tang Yu said calmly, Pei Mingyi passed away. I'm Chi-Chi's only relative. Male relative. Meng Qingqing stared at him in a daze for a long time. Then, he asked, then do you roleplay? He couldn't imagine it. Just thinking about it gave him a nosebleed. Tang Yu was such a decent person, but he was also such a pervert. Tang Yu ignored him. How could he reveal too much about the private matters between him and Pei Chi-Chi? Chatting like this for a while diluted some of his feelings of longing. Speaking of which, it was a little funny. He had only been away for 2 hours, but he already missed his little fellow. It was probably the sequelae of being inseparable for a month. At 6:00 in the evening, Paris time, the private plane landed, and then took a car to the Hilton Hotel. Originally, Meng Qingqing had booked a room for himself, but Tang Yu stopped him. Qingqing, stay with me. Meng Qingqing looked at him with a very strange expression. After a while, he coughed lightly, Tang Yu, if you have been too abstinent recently, I can help you think of a way. But I can't do it myself, I am a straight man. Tang Yu swiped his card and walked into the presidential suite. He turned around and said, that's what I wanted to tell you. Meng Qingqing touched his nose and followed him in. Actually, he was quite good-looking. This suite covered an area of about 800 square meters. It was divided into a master bedroom, a secondary bedroom, a children's room, a conference room, and a study. It was fully functional. Of course, it was also expensive, more than $30,000 a night. Meng Qingqing put his luggage away and pulled his tie when he walked out. I know, you want me to protect you. Tang Yu glanced at him and did not say anything. He just held the red wine in his hand and took a sip. Meng Qingqing looked at him and teased, it's not easy for a man to come out. A man without a wife by his side should be a bird released from the cage. As soon as he said that, he felt that his analogy was really too appropriate. Tang Yu, a bird released from the cage, this meeting was quite important, otherwise Tang Yu would not have come in person. It was not that he had to do anything special, but out of courtesy, he had to show his face. At the same time, Lei Group and Jean Taihe were also partners, and there would be a dinner party a week later. Tang Yu glanced at him and did not say anything, slowly tasting the wine. Chapter 698. Tang Yu glanced at him and didn't say anything, sipping his wine slowly. As expected, he saw Shen Lian at the meeting the next day, but he just glanced at her and didn't talk to her the whole time. What made Shen Lian want to vomit blood was that the 8 bodyguards were still following her even though she was in France. Those who didn't know better would think that she was being ostentatious. What was even more incomprehensible was that these 8 people could enter the headquarters of Lei as if they were in their own backyard. During the meeting, Shen Lian kept staring at Tang Yu, but the latter was indifferent. Meng Qingqing was watching from the side. As a bystander, it was time for Shen Lian to let it go. Tang Yu and Pei Qiqi were married and had a child. Tang Yu spoiled Pei Qiqi so much that there probably wouldn't be a day when they would divorce. Shen Lian was rich, beautiful, and had a good figure. There were people chasing after her from City B to France. Why bother? After the meeting, Tang Yu turned down President Lei's invitation and returned to the hotel. He was still blocked by Shen Lian at the door of the suite. Tang Yu, ask them to leave. Shen Lian's voice was a little hoarse. Tang Yu didn't say a word. After a long time, he said slowly, Shen Lian, do you know what these 8 people are for? Shen Lian was stunned. Wasn't it to monitor them? Tang Yu pursed his thin lips. If something happens to Qiqi one day, Shen Lian was even more stunned. If something happened to Pei Qiqi, would these 8 people immediately deal with her in the same way? No, it's 100 times. Tang Yu didn't have the slightest expression. Shen Lian, that's enough. You've done enough. Then he opened the door and walked into the room, but Shen Lian was still in a daze. She was stunned. So she had been wrong all along. It turned out that those people had such an effect. She had thought too soft-hearted of Tang Yu. But why didn't he say it? Why did he say it now? She turned around and saw the 8 people standing behind her. She felt a chill down her spine. With trembling hands, she took out her mobile phone and typed quickly. She only wrote a few words, halt all operations. After writing these words, her body was trembling. She believed that as long as she did it, if anything happened to Pei Qiqi, Tang Yu would blame it on her. Moreover, he would be 100 times more ruthless. Shen Lian bit her lip, her eyes filled with unwillingness. However, no matter how unwilling she was, she had no chance to get close to Tang Yu. She could only look at him from afar, watching him mature. Even standing in the middle of a group of Europeans, he was still dazzling and dazzling. Shen Lian squinted her eyes and just looked at it. As she looked, her eyes felt a little sore. She drank a lot of alcohol. In the past, he was hers. At that time, they were very close. Everyone said that they were a good match. Tang Yu also said that she was the prettiest girl in the world in a white dress. So many years of love couldn't compare to a few months of Pei Qiqi. Was physical contact that important? So important that he fell in love with Pei Qiqi so quickly. Shen Lian looked at Tang Yu and drank the red wine in her glass. She wore a white dress today. The front was very conservative, and the back was hollowed out, showing off her beautiful back. All the men present were secretly looking at her. But in her eyes, there was no one else but Tang Yu. She saw his sexy Adam's apple move when he raised his head to drink. She still remembered kissing him there many years ago. At that time, he was still very young and not as mature as he was now. Chapter 699. The nightlife in Paris was very rich, but Tang Yu was not in the mood to miss it. He would return to City B early the next morning, and he was eager to go home. He drank the last mouthful of wine and slowly walked out of the hall. The air outside was a little moist, and it was very beautiful with the night sky. He was not in the mood to appreciate it. He walked to the parking lot, and the driver opened the door for him. When he returned to the top floor of the Hilton Hotel, he was surprised to see Shen Lian. Although the 8 King Kongs were around, it did not stop Shen Lian from showing off her beauty. Shen Lian was obviously drunk. Her hand was on the wall, and her eyes were full of lust as she looked at Tang Yu. In her eyes, besides seduction, there was also provocation. No man could stand this. Not wanting and not daring to want were two different things. Tang Yu looked at Shen Lian quietly, and he opened the door, ready to go in. A slender and soft arm wrapped around him. Shen Lian hugged him from behind and murmured, "Tang Yu, hug me." She was behind him, and her hot face was pressed against his back. Her slender fingers were also moving upwards. "Let go." Tang Yu's voice was calm. "Be more self-conscious, Ms. Shen." He called her Ms. Shen. Shen Lian chuckled. She tilted her head and looked up at his side profile. "I'm not Ms. Shen." "No, Tang Yu, I'm not. I just want to go back to being the original Shen Lian." She was crying. "Tang Yu, let's go back to the past. Let's pretend that nothing happened. Let's be together. There's no one else between us. There's no Qin Anlin, no Pei Chi. Okay." He did not know how much she missed him, and how much she loved him. She was wrong. If she could do it all over again, she would not choose to sleep with Qin Anlin to test him. She would listen to him and be good. Tang Yu firmly broke away from Shen Lian and turned his head. His noble expression did not change at all because of her confession and contact. His gaze was calm. "Shen Lian, it's been so many years. Why bother thinking about it? If you wanted to start over, why didn't you compensate Uncle Shen?" Shen Lian shook her head gently, tears still on her face. She was indeed a woman with the appearance of a lotus. She was especially beautiful when she cried at this moment, giving off a delicate and touching feeling. However, Tang Yu was not moved at all. He only sighed in his heart. Many years ago, Shen Lian used to be beautiful. Or perhaps, he had let her down. He walked in firmly. Shen Lian called his name hoarsely behind him, "Tang Yu, don't you love me anymore?" He had walked out long ago, but she did not. She was still at the same spot, still remembering what he said in the past. "Tang Yu, I want to forget too. I want to give up too. But I can't do it." Shen Lian had never been so humble in front of him before. She was almost begging him. After that, she dropped her gown on the ground. Her fair body was enough to make any man crazy and infatuated. She just stood there like that, not caring if the 8 men saw it or not. She only knew that she only had one chance. Because Tang Yu was at his softest now. If he wanted her, she would have a way to make him marry her. Her tears flowed, and her body glowed under the light. She was indeed beautiful. "Tang Yu, look at me. Don't you feel anything?" She kicked off her gown and walked toward him slowly. Every step he took was like a fatal temptation. Tang Yu stood there. He was a man, but she might be disappointed. Chapter 700. Finally, Shen Lian approached him. She looked at him and said, "Tang Yu, take me." Her voice was weak but alluring. Tang Yu looked at her quietly and said calmly, "Put on your clothes." His voice sounded a little stern, or perhaps a little disappointed. After all, he and Shen Lian had a relationship when they were young. He didn't want her to become like this. Shen Lian didn't move. She looked at him and sneered, "You don't dare to, or you can't, or are you afraid that Pei Chi will find out?" Tang Yu paused for 2 seconds before he looked at her and said softly, "Qingqing, please ask President Shen to leave." Meng Qingqing. Shen Lian was stunned. She didn't expect Meng Qingqing to be in this room. Meng Qingqing was different from the bodyguards. Although Meng Qingqing was only Tang Yu's personal assistant, this personal assistant was also a respected person in City B. Shen Lian couldn't lower herself in front of Meng Qingqing. At the same time, she also knew why Tang Yu wanted to stay in the same room with Meng Qingqing. It was to guard against her. Shen Lian tilted her head and her eyes were provocative. "Tang Yu, I don't believe that you don't feel anything at all." Her fingers moved downwards, but she didn't succeed. Tang Yu grabbed her hand and said in a deep voice, "Shen Lian, save some face for yourself." With that said, he pushed her away. Shen Lian was stunned. He was actually so indifferent. She knew that she was beautiful enough and seductive enough tonight. The perfume she wore tonight was specially made to charm men, but Tang Yu didn't have any feelings for her at all. Seeing her like this, Meng Qingqing sighed. She picked up Shen Lian's clothes from the ground and handed them to her. She touched her nose and said, "The air conditioning is good. Don't catch a cold." Sigh, looking at Shen Lian's figure, "I'm going to vomit blood." Even Tang Yu can resist it. Shen Lian hugged her gown, feeling extremely embarrassed. She had really made a big joke out of herself. Just as she was putting on her clothes with trembling hands, Tang Yu came out of the bedroom with his documents in his hand. His voice was a little anxious. "Qingqing, stay here to deal with the aftermath. I need to return to B City immediately." Meng Qingqing was dumbfounded. Could he have been scared off by Shen Lian? That's impossible. Tang Yu has seen all kinds of storms and waves. While he was dumbfounded, Tang Yu had already left. Meng Qingqing raised his hand and said, "All right, he's gone. CEO Shen can leave now, right? Why don't we have a drink?" Shen Lian's answer was to throw a high-heeled shoe at his face. The white shoe slid down Meng Qingqing's face. Meng Qingqing was dumbfounded. With such a bad temper, it was no wonder that no man wanted her. Tang Yu didn't want her, and even Qin Anlin didn't want her. Shen Lian chased after him barefoot. When she reached the entrance of the hotel, Tang Yu was opening the car door and getting into the car. "Tang Yu." She quickly went over and grabbed his arm. "Don't go." She knew that he rushed back to B City for Pei Chi. She wouldn't let him go. She wouldn't let him go. Tang Yu looked at Shen Lian coldly. "Let go." He pushed her away roughly, got into the car, closed the door, and started the car quickly. The car drove away like a streamline, and she stood there in tears. She couldn't make him stay, from body to soul. Shen Lian smiled with tears flowing down her face. She smiled softly. Something must have happened to that bitch, Pei Chi. Otherwise, Tang Yu wouldn't have rushed back. In the night of Paris, Shen Lian lost herself. Chapter 701. Tang Yu returned to B City as soon as possible. Late at night, he walked along the corridor of the hospital, his footsteps cold and clear. He pushed open the door to Dr. May's office. Dr. May, her assistant, and even Lin Yun and her husband were all there. Zhao Yi supported his pregnant wife with one hand as he watched Tang Yu enter and help Lin Yun to sit down. Tang Yu's face showed exhaustion from flying for a long time, but his body was still tense. In fact, he was burning with anger. Dr. May told him over the phone that Chi had found an abnormality in her routine pregnancy test. The sudden decrease in white blood cells in her blood was shocking. Of course, the hospital was afraid of making a mistake, so they drew her blood again, but the result was the same. The data showed that the pregnant Pei Chi might be suffering from an acute blood disease, the same disease as Tang Xin. However, Pei Chi was suffering from an acute blood disease. Dr. May's voice was a little low. "Tang Yu, we can't rule out the possibility that the pregnancy weakened her immune system, but I suspect that this disease is inherited in the family, so don't blame yourself. Even if she didn't get pregnant this time, the probability of her getting this disease is still very high when she gets pregnant in the future or when her body is weakened." Tang Yu couldn't hear what she was saying, he could only hear the buzzing sound. Lin Yun's heart was also heavy. She never expected Chi to get sick. At this moment, she thought of Tang Yu's words. Chi had never been treated fairly since she was born, and now, Lin Yun sighed. She didn't know what to say. Tang Yu looked at Dr. May, his voice dry. Is there any way to treat it? If you want chemotherapy now, you have to give up the child. Although it was cruel, Dr. May had to continue. The child is 6 months old now. If it was 7 months, we could perform a C-section and put it in the incubator for a few months, but it's only 6 months. Dr. May sighed. It was already 6 months, what a pity for the child. Tang Yu couldn't hear anything around him. He kept looking forward, there was a white fog in front of him. At this moment, he was faced with the most difficult choice. After a long time, he said hoarsely, do we have to abort the child? That child was Tang Xian's life and Pei Chi-Chi's life. Dr. May took off her glasses. She was silent for a long time before she said, if we find the bone marrow and Chi-Chi has a strong will to live, we can wait until the child is taken out in 7 months before we operate on Chi-Chi. But the prerequisite is that there must be a suitable bone marrow. Dr. May's attitude was quite obvious. She wanted to protect Sir. But if he did that, the Tang family might not have an heir. Tang Yu wasn't thinking about this. He was more concerned about whether Chi-Chi could lose this child. His answer was no. He couldn't either. In his heart, he vaguely felt the vicissitudes of life. He didn't know if the heavens were playing a joke on them, or if he was playing a joke on himself. He wiped his face. At this moment, he needed to calm down, but he didn't have the time to do so. His Chi-Chi needed him. Late at night, Tang Yu went to see Pei Chi-Chi. He carefully pushed the door open. The moonlight fell on the bed, white and desolate. She was in a deep sleep. One of her hands was placed outside the blanket, resting on her belly. Her other hand was under her head. She was lying on her side. Her belly seemed to have grown a little bigger. Tang Yu slowly sat down. His fingers landed on her long, black hair, and slowly combed it. His eyes were glued to her small face. Her features were still as exquisite as a painting, but there was a trace of paleness. Chapter 702. Tang Yu lowered his head and kissed her forehead. Chi-Chi, are you in pain now? As he kissed her like that, Pei Chi-Chi finally woke up in the middle of the night. When she opened her eyes, she saw his deep eyes in the dim light. Her heart skipped a beat and she hugged his neck. Tang Yu, why are you back? He touched her fluffy head and said, how could I stay in France when you're not feeling well? It's nothing, I just threw up. Pei Chi-Chi nestled in his arms and stuck out her tongue. I heard that some people will vomit during the 3rd trimester. That's probably what happened to me. As she said that, she patted her stomach. If you're not obedient, then I'll let your dad hit your butt when you come out next time. Tang Yu smiled, his dark eyes gazing at her fair little face in the dark. Her little face was filled with satisfaction and happiness. Until now, no one had told her the truth. They all thought that it was better for him to tell her about such things. Tang Yu hated this feeling of helplessness. How could he say such a cruel thing to her? How could he ask her to give up her child? He couldn't do it. But he couldn't ignore her life. He knew that even if she gave up the child for chemotherapy, she would still need a bone marrow transplant to save her life. Bone marrow. There were thousands of knots in Tang Yu's heart. At this moment, he couldn't untie a single one of them. And Tang Xian, in Chi-Chi's heart, Tang Xian was as important as the child. He lay on the hospital bed and coaxed her to sleep. When he came back, she was excited to talk to him, but she fell asleep after a few words. And Tang Yu couldn't sleep the whole night looking at her sleeping face. He invited the best specialist, an overseas specialist, and the result was the same as Dr. May's. Pei Chi-Chi vomited badly and she liked to sleep more and more. But she always thought that it was morning sickness. She often touched her stomach and talked to the baby inside. She asked Tang Yu what the baby should be called. Tang Yu asked her to name it. As a result, Pei Chi carefully looked it up in the dictionary. Finally, she ran to him and asked, Tang Yu, I think you should call me Tang Tang. Tang Yu looked at her and slowly said, then why don't you call me Tangua? His stupid Chi also nodded, that's a good name. Tang Yu was stunned. His mouth seemed to be blocked by something, and it was especially uncomfortable. He didn't say anything. He just reached out and patted Chi-Chi's head. How could he bear to lose such a Chi-Chi? How could he bear to give up the baby in her belly? Under his palm, Pei Chi-Chi was like a docile kitten. After a while, she raised her head and said, then I'll look again. He just looked at her like that, greedy and longing. 3 days later, Dr. May and Tang Yu met alone in Dr. May's office. Tang Yu stood in front of the window, looking out quietly. Dr. May looked at him for a long time, and neither of them spoke. In the deathly silence, Dr. May faintly asked, Tang Yu, have you decided? Because Chi-Chi's illness was not like Tang Xian's. She couldn't delay it. Tang Yu raised his head, and his Adam's apple bulged. After a while, he turned his head and looked at Dr. May. Aunt May, if it's possible, I don't want to choose. His choice meant, maybe he would lose. He would lose Chi-Chi, lose Tang Xian. Or maybe, he wouldn't be able to keep the baby. Chapter 703. Dr. May's eyes were slightly moist. She had been taking care of Chi-Chi. Up until now, Chi-Chi still didn't know that she was sick. She always thought that her vomiting and sleepiness were because of her pregnancy. Just when she thought that there was nothing to talk about today, Tang Yu said, continue to protect the child. 1 month later, he raised his head and said, take the child out. Dr. May was shocked. She couldn't help but get up. Tang Yu. Tang Yu didn't explain, but the truth was not far away. Perhaps the truth had always been around, so Shen Zhongshan became demented. Just yesterday, Dr. Yuan had come to see him and placed a DNA report and a bone marrow match report in front of him. Dr. Yuan said with a heavy heart, Mr. Shen's body was originally unable to withstand this kind of surgery, and now, there's no need to mention it. His only hope was Shen Lian. Of course, Tang Yu knew how much he would have to pay. Tang Yu just smiled and got up. Aunt May, please don't tell Chi-Chi. No one was allowed to tell her. He would rather she hate him, but he wanted her to live. He also wanted the child to live. He also wanted to be with her again one day, even if he had to wait for the rest of his life, even if she hated him to the core. He also wanted her to live a good life. Dr. May was stunned. She also realized that Tang Yu might have made a terrible decision. She opened her mouth and wanted to say something, but in the end, she was disappointed. She couldn't convince Tang Yu, nor could she convince him. This child would never change his mind once he made up his mind. Tang Yu looked at Dr. May quietly and smiled faintly. I can't live without Chi-Chi. But at the same time, he gave up on Tang Xian. Tang Yu pushed the door open and went out. Shen Lian was standing at the door. She was holding a document in her hand. She waved the document in her hand and looked at him. Tang Yu, can we have a cup of coffee now? Tang Yu's gaze was deep. Half an hour later, he sat with her in the corner of a cafe. Shen Lian pushed the file in her hand to Tang Yu and smiled. Before we talk, you can take a look at this. Tang Yu's brows furrowed slightly. His gaze landed on it and he reached out to take it. However, Shen Lian tightened her grip and raised her chin slightly. Tang Yu, have you thought it through? It's like Pandora's box. Once you open it, you can't take it back. She placed her hand on the back of his hand. Tang Yu's hand was slender and had a beautiful jade color. Shen Lian was a little dazed as she looked at it. Tang Yu exerted some force with his fingers and took the document. He was extremely calm. Only he knew the fluctuations in his heart. At this moment, his heart was trembling. There were 2 bone marrow matches, one for Shen Lian and the other for Tang Xin. Shen Lian and Pei Chi were actually compatible. When his gaze landed on it, Shen Lian chuckled and said, "Tang Yu, are the heavens helping me?" Tang Yu was still quiet. He looked at it for a long time and finally shifted his gaze back to Shen Lian. "What do you want?" Shen Lian supported her chin with her fingers and drew circles on the table with her other hand. "What if I want you to kneel down and beg me?" Tang Yu's gaze tensed and she giggled. "Of course I won't do that. Tang Yu, why would I want you to kneel down? I'm not humiliating you, I'm humiliating myself." He did not say a word and just looked at her. Chapter 704. Tang Yu narrowed his eyes and stared at Shen Lian. "Of course, you don't have to do that. I can even save Tang Xin, your precious sister, for free." Shen Lian laughed coldly. "She's my precious sister too, isn't she?" Tang Yu's Adam's apple bobbed uncontrollably. The person in front of him was no longer Shen Lian. She was no longer the innocent young girl from before. She was the devil. "Tang Yu, you can choose between your precious sister and Tang Xin. If it's me, I'll choose Tang Xin. If my sister dies, I can still marry my younger sister." Shen Lian leaned forward. "Isn't that perfect?" Suddenly, her arm was caught. He used all his strength. She was in pain, but Shen Lian was happy. She finally saw Tang Yu in a dilemma. She saw that he was no longer so indifferent when facing her. The veins on Tang Yu's forehead almost popped out. He narrowed his eyes and looked at Shen Lian. His thin lips were pressed into a straight line. "Is it difficult?" Shen Lian laughed softly. "Now, let's count down. 5, 4, 3, 2. Tang Yu's fingers loosened. A victorious smile appeared on Shen Lian's face. But there was a hint of bitterness in it. In the end, he was willing to do anything for Pei Chi. In the end, it was still for that bitch. "I can save her. Divorce her and let her attend our engagement ceremony." Shen Lian smiled, but there was no smile in her eyes. She finally got everything she wanted. The company, Tang Yu. But in the face of victory, she was happy, but her heart was empty. Tang Yu slowly leaned back in his chair. He looked at Shen Lian calmly. He was so calm that she was a little scared. She thought he wouldn't agree, but Tang Yu said, "I'll handle everything between us. You're not allowed to disturb or hurt her." Shen Lian was a little annoyed. "Tang Yu, do you think you still have any conditions to negotiate with me? If you don't agree, we can stop talking." His gaze was firm and calm, his expression impeccable. Shen Lian tried to find a flaw in his eyes, but there was nothing. In terms of determination, she would never be a match for Tang Yu. Even if they were talking about the life and death of his sweetheart, it would still be the same. She gritted her teeth. "All right." There was no fluctuation in Tang Yu's eyes. "Our engagement was after Pei Chi had her bone marrow changed." Shen Lian sneered, "You won't deny it when the time comes, right?" Tang Yu didn't say anything. Shen Lian felt that she had asked a stupid question, but she soon cheered up. "Tang Yu, for the sake of fairness, I think you have to do something to make me believe in your sincerity." As she said that, she took out a document from her bag. "I think this is a mutual guarantee for us, right?" Tang Yu stared at the document and then looked up at Shen Lian. There was a trace of malice in his eyes. "If you don't sign it, you can only say sorry. You're Pei Chi, your baby sister, your child. Oh yes, I forgot. No matter what, that child can't be born. What a pity. Shen Lian chuckled and blew at him. Tang Yu closed his eyes, then took out a cigarette, lit it, and slowly took a few puffs. I'll sign it before the operation. He looked at her. Shen Lian, are you happy to do this? Shen Lian was stunned. Tang Yu got up and walked out. Chapter 705. When Tang Yu returned to the hospital, he didn't immediately go to see Pei Qi. He went to see Shen Zhongshan. Shen Zhongshan was still the same as before. He still called her little sister and asked for food. He was like a child, carefree and carefree. Tang Yu pushed the door open and entered. The nurse looked at him in surprise. You guys go out first. Tang Yu stood at the door and said quietly. The nurse immediately went out and closed the door. Shen Zhongshan was sitting in his wheelchair and eating. He was no longer the skinny middle-aged man he used to be. Instead, he was a little chubby. Inexplicably, it was a little funny. Tang Yu slowly walked over and squatted in front of Shen Zhongshan. He looked up at the man. Shen Zhongshan had done a match with Tang Xian before. He probably wanted to make it up to her. Tang Yu's expression was a little cold. He took the banana from Shen Zhongshan's hand and slowly fed it to him. His voice was low and deep. Uncle Shen, I'm sorry. This time, I might not be able to do anything. Between Pei Qi and Tang Xian, he chose Qi without hesitation. Shen Zhongshan mechanically ate the banana, one bite at a time, as if he didn't feel anything. It was as if everything Tang Yu said had nothing to do with him. Uncle Shen, I'm sorry. Tang Yu put his finger on the back of Shen Zhongshan's hand and said in a low voice. Shen Zhongshan still didn't say anything. Tang Yu smiled faintly, but it was a bitter smile. After a long time, he finished feeding the banana and got up to leave. The door closed. Shen Zhongshan was still eating the banana. Suddenly, he stopped and 2 lines of tears flowed down from his old eyes. Qi, Tang Xian. Qi, Tang Xian. Little sister, food, I want to eat, but why did his heart hurt so much? Tang Yu stood outside for a while before returning to the ward. Pei Qi was lying on the bed reading a fairy tale. When she saw Tang Yu, she pouted. Tang Yu, it's so boring. He stood outside, his heart as cold as water. Pei Qi looked at his expression and asked carefully, Tang Yu, what's wrong? He slowly walked over and sat beside her. He reached out and slowly stroked her long hair. He said in a low voice, Qi, it's okay. He gently brought her into his arms and rested his chin on her hair. Just like that, he held her and the child in his arms. Qi, is this the last time I hug you like this? He lowered his head and kissed her passionately. Pei Qi felt that he was acting strangely today. Something was not right. A shadow clouded her heart. She wanted to ask, but she didn't dare to. Finally, she hugged his waist and put her face on his chest. His heart was beating really fast. Qi, let's go home tomorrow. Tang Yu lowered his head and kissed the little person in his arms. Then he seemed to think of something. Our child will be called Tang, and her nickname will be Xiaoxin, okay? Is that really the name? I just said it casually. And Xiaoxin, is it the same name as Tang Xian? Qi stretched her little head and looked at him eagerly. Tang Yu patted her little head and smiled faintly. He didn't say anything. They returned to the rose garden. She still vomited occasionally. Tang Yu asked her to take a lot of medicine every day. She was worried that it would affect the child, so she refused to take it. He said that it was not affected by the medicine prescribed by Dr. May. Pregnancy was very painful and uncomfortable, but when she thought of the little baby in her belly, she felt that it was nothing. Chapter 706. Every night, he would put her on the ivory-colored bed and kiss her tenderly. He carefully worshipped and kissed every inch of her body. Pei-Chi-Chi didn't know why he was torturing himself like this. He couldn't do it, but he insisted on doing it every day. The storm started half a month later. An entertainment reporter dug up Zhao Ke's story, and Pei-Chi-Chi's identity was exposed. The fact that she was Zhao Ke's daughter was publicized in the media, and the Lin and Tang families were under great pressure. Pei-Chi-Chi naturally saw it. She looked at it for a while and didn't say a word. After a long time, she looked at Tang Yu. Why did someone write this all of a sudden? Do you care? Tang Yu looked at her and smiled. Our Chi-Chi should be very calm now. Pei-Chi-Chi lowered her eyes. Pei Huan called me yesterday and said that she wanted to go back to the Pei group. I didn't agree, but she said that she had important evidence. If I didn't agree, she would ruin your reputation. She couldn't understand. Did the Pei group have anything to do with Tang Yu's reputation? She wanted to meet Pei Huan, but Tang Yu might not agree. To her surprise, Tang Yu agreed and nodded. It's good to meet her. Ask her to come in the afternoon, and I'll meet her too. Pei-Chi-Chi looked at Tang Yu and didn't say a word for a long time. She had been with him for a long time, and he seemed to be the same as before. However, she was his wife, and she could still feel the slight difference in him. Tang Yu was hiding something from her. He got up and kissed her. I'll go upstairs to deal with some business. Pei-Chi-Chi nodded and watched him go upstairs. Tang Yu paused for a moment and walked to the stairs. When he reached the middle of the stairs, he turned his head and looked at her. Pei-Chi-Chi also looked up at him. Something was different. They were still in love, and they were still living together. She seemed to be very happy, but she was already beginning to feel uneasy. Tang Yu smiled faintly. This was the last smile he would give her. He slowly went upstairs and walked to the end of the corridor on the second floor. He took out a cigarette and lit it slowly, but he did not smoke. He let the cigarette burn out in his hand. When the red dot finally burned out, he suddenly turned around and looked at Pei-Chi-Chi, who was a few meters away. She guessed it, Tang Yu's eyes were slightly moist. He looked at Pei-Chi-Chi and watched her stand there. She was wearing a set of white floral home clothes. She was still skinny, but her belly was bulging. She looked like a cute frog. Tang Yu's fingers were trembling as he held the cigarette butt. Slowly, he finally approached her. Standing a few steps away from her, he said softly, Chi-Chi, we can't be together. Her pupils dilated as she stared at him. The speculation on the internet is true. You are not Pei Mingyi's child. He looked at her as if she was a helpless little animal. His heart tightened and almost broke. The person he did not want to hurt the most was Pei-Chi-Chi, but he was hurting her at this moment. He even wanted to end her love for him with his own hands. He knew that it was very difficult, but he forced himself to do it. Because of this, his Chi-Chi could survive. He chose Chi-Chi and gave up Tang Xian. It was already a sin. Pei-Chi-Chi looked at him and could not say a word for a long time. Chapter 707. Tang Yu looked at her, frowning, and said quietly, Chi-Chi, we are brother and sister. She looked at him, and her whole body was cold. What was Tang Yu talking about? They were brother and sister. How could they be brother and sister? Her lips moved, trying to force a smile, but she couldn't. Because his face was calm and without a ripple. No. You can't be Zhao Keqing's. Pei-Chi-Chi murmured. She looked at him, hoping that he would tell her that everything was just a joke. Tang Yu looked at her quietly. Chi-Chi, you are Tang Ziyuan's child, just like me. Her eyes narrowed. She didn't believe what he said. There is a paternity test in my study. His eyes were deep. I just got it a week ago, Chi-Chi. A week ago. Pei Chi-Chi's lips trembled, and she stepped back. She didn't want to believe it. She didn't want to believe that it was true. She kept retreating until she reached the wall and had nowhere else to go. She leaned against the wall, and her head was against the cold wall. She looked at him hopelessly, like a desperate little beast. They were brother and sister. What about their marriage? What about their child? Did they not want it anymore? She looked at him anxiously, but Tang Yu was still calm. He was so calm that it scared her. It was as if he had already decided. Her lips moved, and she asked with difficulty, "What are you going to do with my child?" He didn't speak, and just looked at her. After a long time, he went to the study and put a file in her hand. His voice was still as gentle as before, but it was different. She heard him say, "Chi-Chi, this child can't be kept." Can't be kept, really. Her tears fell, and her eyes finally fell on the file. She opened it gently, she read it anxiously. After reading it, she clenched the papers tightly. She was Tang Ziyuan's daughter. I don't believe it. Pei Chi-Chi suddenly said harshly. Her fingers tore the paper into pieces, as if she could tear apart all reality. How could she be Tang Yu's sister? So all this time, she had been having sex with her brother. How could such a ridiculous thing happen? Tang Yu, I don't believe it, I don't believe a word of it. She covered her head, unwilling to accept such a reality. Tang Yu stood there with his hands clenched into fists. He really wanted to hug her and tell her that this wasn't real. But he couldn't do that. If she knew the truth, she would rather die than accept Shen Lian's bone marrow. He could only make her hate him. Chi-Chi, this is the reality that we have no choice but to accept. He finally stepped forward and held her shoulders. However, Pei Chi-Chi pushed him away with one hand. There was a guarded look in her eyes, as if she was an injured animal. She closed her eyes and held the wall with her fingers to stand still. After a long time, she opened her eyes and looked at Tang Yu. She asked him softly, "Do you not want our baby anymore?" Tang Yu saw the heartache in her eyes, but he was in 100 times more pain than she was. He didn't answer, but Pei Chi-Chi found the answer in his eyes. You don't even want me anymore, do you? Her voice was soft, and it sounded like a storm was brewing. Tang Yu said quietly, Chi-Chi, you can't have this child. She was crying and her body was pressed against the wall. This was the only way she could stand and talk to him. Chapter 708. You can't. Tang Yu, I'm your sister. Then you hug and kiss your sister every day. Don't you feel guilty? She almost roared at the end. He closed his eyes. Chi-Chi, I love you. Love? She looked at him in a daze. Then let's continue to be together. I'll give birth to this child, okay? He looked at her with a heartache. Pei Chi-Chi held onto her abdomen and supported herself as she slowly walked over. They stood face to face. It had only been 5 minutes, but her world had been turned upside down. She looked up at him with tears streaming down her face. She used the most humble posture in her life. Tang Yu, please, let me give birth to this child, okay? She pulled his hand and placed it on her stomach. She's our child. You said you love her, didn't you? Her empty eyes searched his face anxiously, trying to find traces of him softening. But there was none. He only pulled her into his arms and closed his eyes in pain. Chi-Chi, be rational. Her entire body stiffened. He called her rational. Slowly, slowly, she left his arms. She looked at him, her eyes full of unfamiliarity. Is your love rational? She asked him softly and took 2 steps back. She instinctively hugged her stomach and stared at him. Tang Yu, do you still want me? She was almost forcing him to make a decision. Her slender and fragile body was trembling. She could barely stand with her hand on her stomach, but she still stood there stubbornly, waiting for his answer. Tang Yu's thin lips were tightly pursed, and the muscles on his face were trembling violently. Even though he had built it countless times, he still couldn't say it in front of her. Tang Yu, is it hard to answer? She wiped away the tears on her face and said hoarsely. The love you talked about, is it all gone? Because I'm your sister. There was a crazed look on her face. There was a flickering flame, like a burning fire, like the brightest shooting star in the universe. I don't care. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face again. Tang Yu, I don't care. I don't care if I'm your little sister, I don't care if I'm Tang Ziyuan's daughter, as long as I'm with you, do you hear me? She raised her head and roared at him, trying her best not to cry, trying her best to be strong. Yes, so what if they are brother and sister? She wanted to be with him. He had said that no matter what, he would not let go of her hand. Tang Yu felt as if a knife was being twisted in his heart. His Chi-Chi. His Chi-Chi had once left him and avoided him because she was Xiao Ke's daughter. Because she hid her love deeply, giving it once was her everything. At this moment, she was like a moth flying into a flame, desperately wanting to be with him. But he could not. If she was his sister, he didn't care. However, only her life would not allow him to get close to her again. She was in pain, and he was in even more pain. His fingers clenched into fists. He watched her cry in pain, watched her tear her heart out. And he was the one who made her suffer, the one who made her tear her heart out. He couldn't go forward. He could only accompany her, through the darkest time. He couldn't let go completely. He wanted her Chi-Chi to be well taken care of, even if she hated him, even if he would live a life without sunlight for a long time. But Chi-Chi, I can wait. One day, when I can walk to your side again, I will say to you, Pei Chi-Chi, long time no see. Chapter 709. The sun rose slowly, lighting up the long hallway, leaving a shadow on her face and his. Deeply, deeply engraved their faces in each other's hearts. She looked at him with a strange look in her eyes, she begged him, but it was useless. Softly, she asked him with tears in her eyes, if you don't want children, you want to divorce me, right? He said he couldn't have such a scandal, he couldn't announce to the public that he had an affair with his sister, got married, and had children. He said he had the lifelines of both the Lin and Tang families behind him. He said he could only give up on her and sacrifice her. Then what about her love? What about the love he spoke of? What about their children? Were they all going to be sacrificed? Sacrificed, gone, her eyes were filled with white. She couldn't see anything, she couldn't see him. Tang Yu sat in front of the bed and looked at Pei Chi-Chi. She had fainted. There was pain in his eyes as his slender fingers fell on her cold face. Chi-Chi, it hurts, right? I'm in pain too, but I can't wait to do this. He closed his eyes and walked to the study room. He opened another secret compartment and moved the entire wall. Inside, there was a medical room. It took up a lot of space, about 100 square meters, with all kinds of medical equipment. Dr. May stood there, looking at Tang Yu and sighing, Tang Yu, have you thought it through? You might never get her forgiveness for what you did. Tang Yu walked to a small crib and slowly stroked it with his fingers. Maybe his child didn't need this for the time being and could only stay in the incubator. Maybe he couldn't accompany the premature baby for the time being. He stroked it carefully and looked at it for a long time on behalf of Pei Chi-Chi. The crib was pink, a little out of place in this plain white space, but it was the last warm color in his heart. There would be a long time in the future when his world would only be gray and black. Dr. May waited for a long time before Tang Yu said softly, "I can wait." These 3 words exhausted all of Tang Yu's feelings. He could wait. His love could be patience, it could be endless waiting. For a long time, she hated him, until she returned to his side. Dr. May felt a lump in her throat. Tang Yu's decision made things difficult for himself and many others. Other than Lin Yun and her husband, she was the only one who knew the truth. Even Tang Ziyuan didn't know much about it. "Auntie May, she's asleep," Tang Yu said softly. Then, he raised his head, and hot tears slid down the corners of his eyes. He couldn't control them. "Chi-Chi, I'll wait for you here. You remember to go home. Remember what I said, no matter when, I only have you." Tang Yu belonged to Pei Chi-Chi. He belonged to her, not any other woman. When Pei Chi-Chi woke up, it was already afternoon. She heard Pei Huan's voice, Pei Huan's piercing voice. She rested her head on the pillow, and her little face was extremely pale. Until now, her ears were buzzing, and she was in a trance. She couldn't tell what time it was, and she couldn't tell if she was in a dream or reality. If it weren't for Pei Huan's voice, she would rather believe that she was still dreaming. Downstairs, Pei Huan brought a lawyer over. She sat on the sofa in the rose garden and looked around anxiously. It was dreamy luxury. Did Pei Chi-Chi usually live in such a castle-like place? Then why did she compete with her for the Pei Corporation? Chapter 7:10. She looked at it jealously, but soon she became excited. Pei Chi-Chi would be kicked out of the house soon. The Tang and Lin families would never tolerate such a scandal of sibling love. She really wanted to see Pei Chi-Chi look like a stray dog. Tang Yu sat opposite her and said calmly, "Miss Pei, are you here for the Pei Corporation?" Before Pei Huan could speak, Tang Yu continued, "There is a contract here. You can take a look." Pei Huan took it and looked at it. She didn't understand it, so she handed it to the lawyer next to her. The lawyer only read a few lines and looked up at Tang Yu in surprise. What a strange contract. It said that Xing Yuan would take over the management of the Pei Corporation, and 100% of the Pei Corporation's profits would go to Pei Huan. This was a business that was guaranteed to be profitable. The lawyer whispered to Pei Huan. Pei Huan stared at Tang Yu and said, "Why are you doing this? Is this for Pei Chi-Chi? And can you guarantee that Pei Chi-Chi will hand over the shares?" "That's not what you should be concerned about, Pei Huan. If you are willing to sign it, then sign it. If not, I won't force you," Tang Yu said coldly. Pei Huan chuckled like a sly fox and said, "What if this can't satisfy my appetite? Then Miss Pei, you can sue me. I think my legal team is enough to make you get nothing." Tang Yu had already stood up. If Pei Huan wasn't a pawn in his plan, he wouldn't have the patience to deal with her. Pei Huan narrowed her eyes and her skin that had been injected with hyaluronic acid trembled abnormally. After a long time, she suddenly exclaimed, "Did you release that news?" Her eyes widened and she stared at Tang Yu in disbelief. If Tang Yu did it on purpose, then he wanted to divorce Pei Chi-Chi. Why did he do that? Pei Huan didn't know why she was like this, for Pei Chi-Chi. She actually felt sad for Pei Chi-Chi. She hated Pei Chi-Chi the most. No, Tang Yu loved Pei Chi-Chi very much. How could such a man betray Pei Chi-Chi? Tang Yu's voice was as cold as ever. "This is not something you can ask." The more he didn't explain, the more suspicious Pei Huan became. Pei Huan, if you want to get the Pei family, then don't ask too much. It won't do you any good. The answer in Pei Huan's heart was about to come out. She looked at Tang Yu and her lips moved. In the end, she still said softly, I agree. She told herself that betraying Pei Chi was actually not a big deal. Their relationship was not good to begin with. There had always been enmity between them. Yes, it's nothing, Pei Huan tried her best to convince herself, but when she finished signing and went out, her legs went soft. She turned her head and looked at the magnificent fantasy castle. This was the castle that Tang Yu had built for Pei Chi. Pei Chi was even pregnant. Was she going to be kicked out by Tang Yu just like that? Pei Huan lowered her eyes and whispered, Cinderella's story is just a fairy tale. The lawyer on the side was still marveling at the luxury here. Pei Huan sneered, so what? It's not just a golden cage. Downstairs, Tang Yu sat quietly. Ever since Pei Chi fell ill, every step he took had been difficult. Every decision he made was enough to make him feel pain in his heart. But he had to continue. Pei Chi stood on the stairs and looked at him, she just came down. Although she didn't hear what they were talking about, she could guess that Tang Yu had agreed to return the Pei family to Pei Huan. Chapter 7:11. She stood on the stairs and looked at Tang Yu. Her voice was cold. Tang Yu, what if I don't sign it? She was talking about the divorce agreement. Tang Yu turned sideways and raised his head to look at her standing on the stairs. Her fingers were clenched tightly against the handrail. He said softly, in a few days, Dad will come to pick you up after the operation. Dad? Was it Tang Ziyuan? Pei Chi's eyes widened. She stared at Tang Yu. Also, he said the operation. Was he going to abort her child? Pei Chi bit her lips so hard that they bled. She stared at him. I won't abort this child. Tang Yu looked at her and said in a low voice, reality will not allow this child to be born. He forced himself to be cruel to her and forced himself to be emotionless. Her face was pale. After a while, she smiled softly. She smiled and cried. In just one day, she felt that she had cried all the tears of her life. Tang Yu, that's good. She smiled while crying. She looked at him. I'll sign it, but the child is mine. Her fingers tightly covered her lower abdomen, for fear that he would take away her child. She looked at him as if she was looking at a chopper. Her eyes were slowly filled with pain, and her hands were clenched tightly. A wisp of blood stained the hem of her dress. Pei Chi lowered her head and took a look. Her eyes were red. Her eyes were a little dazed. She looked at Tang Yu's shocked expression. At this time, there was only his shocked expression left in her world. His expression was magnified, and then pain, a faint smile appeared on her pretty little face. Tang Yu, the child is going to be gone because she knows that you don't want her anymore, don't want her, don't want me. Darkness, falling. In the dizziness, there was a kind of heart-wrenching pain, as if there was a force pulling the child out of her body. Pain, coma, mixed with their past. Tang Yu, our child will be called Tang Tang. Pei Chi, wouldn't it be better to just call her Tanghua? Tang Yu, do you not like girls? Why would I? I want her to be like you. Chi, no matter how many children I have, the one I like the most is the oldest one. I'm not a baby. No. Then why did you call me daddy last night, huh? Pain. The past kept replaying in her mind, refusing to let her go. It turned into Shen Yin's cries of pain, her unwillingness, and her hatred towards him. Amidst her heart-wrenching screams, a weak baby cry rang out. It was very weak, almost non-existent, but he still heard it. Tang Yu stood outside and raised his head. There were tears in his eyes. It was their child. Dr. Mei walked out and patted his shoulder. We need to move Chi-Chi to Xingyuan Hospital immediately. Everything is ready. Tang Yu walked in and trembled as he looked at the girl he loved lying there with a pale face. Her lower abdomen was flat. He reached out and gently touched her little face. A drop of hot tears fell on her porcelain-white face. After a long time, his eyes fell on the little green and white thing in the incubator. The child who was not even a month old was wrinkled. One of her little hands was waving, and the other hand was clenched into a fist. Her brows were furrowed, as if she was unhappy about being disturbed. Tang Yu overlapped his hand with the little girl's through the glass. He smiled and said, "Hi, baby." The next day, Lin Yun flew to the United States to recuperate. Xiao Yi accompanied her. Chapter 7:12. When Pei Chi-Chi woke up, her surroundings were white, and the air was filled with the smell of disinfectant. She was in a daze and didn't want to wake up. But she had a feeling that she didn't have a baby in her belly. She slept for 1 day, 2 days, 2 weeks. It was painful. She could feel the nurses walking back and forth around her. She could feel countless needles pricking her body. She could feel Tang Yu beside her. But she didn't want him. The baby was gone. They were over. It was a month later when Pei Chi-Chi really woke up. She had lost a lot of weight. She opened her eyes. Her surroundings were white. In the quiet ward, a nurse was changing her drip. She opened her eyes. When she was a little more clear-headed, she slowly put her fingers on her lower abdomen. There was nothing there. There was nothing there. She didn't make a sound. She just put her hand there and slowly touched it. She didn't make a sound, but her face was already covered with tears. The blood that afternoon seemed to be engraved in her heart, bones, and blood. After a long time, she asked in a hoarse voice, "Where is Mr. Tang?" The nurse was shocked. Mrs. Tang woke up. "Mrs. Tang." The nurse stammered, "I'll call him right away." Pei Chi-Chi pursed her lips. "Don't call me Mrs. Tang. Soon, I won't be." The nurse was a little embarrassed. She wanted to say something, but she didn't say the last sentence. There were only 3 people in this VIP ward, and each of them had signed a confidentiality agreement. She wanted to say something but stopped. Finally, after the examination, she went outside to call Tang Yu. Tang Yu came in. Before he walked to Pei Chi-Chi, she had already said with a faint and hoarse voice, "It's so strange. You appeared so quickly, Mr. Tang." Tang Yu's lips moved. Finally, he closed his eyes. "Chi-Chi, you were in a coma for a month." "Really? Then please take care of me for a month, Mr. Tang." "Thank you." Her eyes were fixed on the ceiling, dull and empty. Her voice was soft. "What about the agreement?" Tang Yu was stunned. He immediately understood what she was talking about. His heart felt like it was being twisted by a knife. She was in a coma for a month, and he kept her for a month. In the end, he couldn't keep her. Right now, she hated him to the core. "Chi-Chi, I won't regret it, even if you hate me for the rest of your life." His voice was extremely dry. "There's no need to be in such a hurry. Mr. Tang, I'm very anxious." Her gaze finally landed on his face. There was a sense of unfamiliarity and coldness in her eyes. This was the first time he had seen Pei Chi-Chi. An insecure Pei Chi-Chi. He had once melted her with his love, but now he was using his cruelty to force her back to the Pei Chi-Chi of the past. "I don't want to, and I don't dare to have anything to do with Mr. Tang." Her lips were so pale that they were almost transparent. She looked at him and smiled softly. Her smile was bitter and it was like a knife stabbing deep into his heart. She looked at him with disappointment and pain in her eyes. And he was even more so. His lips moved slightly. He wanted to say something, but he couldn't say a word. Their child was not out of danger yet, so he couldn't tell her the truth. In addition, the contract he signed with Shen Lian also made him under the control of others. If Tang Yu was alone, he could risk his life. But he wasn't. He had too many burdens behind him. So even if she had an operation, he could only bury all of it in his heart. In the end, he could only let go. He could only let go of her, but Chi-Chi, one day, you will come back to me. Chapter 7:13. Pei Chi-Chi looked at him with sadness in her eyes. She looked like an injured animal. Tang Yu, I never thought that this day would come. We would end up like this. Go out. I'm a little tired. Pei Chi-Chi suddenly closed her eyes. Her fingers gently touched her lower abdomen, as if the child was still there. His eyes fell on her fingers and his gaze froze. He looked at her pale and delicate face with greed, knowing that she had made up her mind. He remembered that day when she said to him like a madwoman, Tang Yu, even if we are siblings, I want to be with you. He was shocked. Tang Yu had always thought that Chi-Chi was a reserved person, but he never thought that she loved him so much. But how much she loved him was how much she hated him at this moment. He stood there while she closed her eyes. She didn't want to look at him anymore. Even a glance was unnecessary. Tang Yu smiled dryly and didn't say anything. He walked out and just closed the door. He was punched in the face. The person in front of him was Meng Qingqing. Meng Qingqing's face was a little pale. He stared at Tang Yu's face and said coldly, Tang Yu, you're really a good brother. Tang Yu's body fell on the wall. He had lost a lot of weight in just a month. His expression was colder than before. He reached out and slowly wiped the blood off the corner of his mouth. He looked at Meng Qingqing. Meng Qingqing's face was especially ugly. His voice was a little low and hoarse. Let's talk outside. The two of them went to the rooftop. The wind on the rooftop was very strong. The autumn sun was weak. They stood face to face. Meng Qingqing looked at Tang Yu coldly. In your heart, 1 year of love is worth more than 10 years of sibling love between you and Tang Xian, right? Did Shen Lian tell you that? Meng Qingqing was still smiling coldly. What did she tell me? She told me that Pei Chi-Chi also has a blood disease. She told me that Shen Zhongshan is Tang Xian and Pei Chi-Chi's father. She told me that you could only save one and you chose Pei Chi-Chi. Is that right? Tang Yu looked at Meng Qingqing and held his breath. Tang Xian's disease is acting up again. Of course you don't know. Because you only have your Pei Chi-Chi in your heart. Meng Qingqing looked straight at Tang Yu. Tang Yu, don't you feel any guilt at all? Tang Yu chuckled softly. He turned around and looked into the distance. After a long time, his voice sounded faintly, Qingqing, I'm already prepared to go to hell. No, I'm already in hell. It was not just him. If anything happened to Tang Xian, Chi-Chi would hate him even more in the future. The child that was just born could not save Tang Xian. His sister, the sister that he watched grow up, was abandoned by him. For the past month, whenever he saw Tang Xian's smiling face, his heart would be filled with sin. Chapter 7:14. Tang Yu raised his head. Qingqing, I've let her down. He turned back to look at Meng Qingqing. He did not explain, nor could he explain. If he had to do it all over again, he would still make the same choice. Meng Qingqing closed his eyes. On the rooftop of the hospital, the two men, who were equally tall and strong, looked at each other for a long time. Meng Qingqing then said softly, "Tang Yu, from now on, I'm no longer your personal assistant. I'll take care of her until she leaves." Tang Yu was stunned. "And you're no longer her brother?" "I'll give her what you can't give her." Meng Qingqing's eyes were hot and his voice was a little choked. Tang Axian doesn't want to see such a bastard brother either. Tang Yu did not speak. When he saw Tang Axian, it was already 3 days later. Tang Axian was in a coma in the ICU for the past 3 days. Other than the disease in her blood, Tang Axian had also triggered other diseases. She was lying on the hospital bed weakly, breathing through her nose. Her body was full of tubes, and the back of her hand was swollen because of the drip. Tang Yu walked over slowly and touched the back of her hand. Tang Axian was so young, but she had suffered so much. "Brother." Tang Axian suddenly woke up. She opened her eyes and looked at his face under the dim yellow light. Tang Yu smiled faintly. Tang Axian smiled too. Her little hand touched him, and her voice was soft and faint. "Brother, you look the best when you smile." She looked pale, and her facial features were not as vivid as before. Her fair skin covered the bones of her hand, and she was very thin. Her lips moved slightly. It was so soft that Tang Yu could not hear it. She kept moving. Tang Yu leaned over and put his ear next to her lips. Tang Axian's lips curled into a faint smile. That smile was like a blooming flower of a young girl, delicate and charming. An extremely weak voice came out of her lips. "Big brother, after I die, give me the book that Lin Jinrong gave me. Can I take it with me?" Tears welled up in Tang Yu's eyes. Tang Axian looked at him anxiously, hoping that he would agree. Tang Yu closed his eyes and nodded. "All right." Dr. Yuan had talked to him about Tang Axian's illness, but there was nothing he could do. He nodded and agreed. Tang Axian's face broke into a faint smile. Her pupils were more unfocused than usual. She stared at Tang Yu for a long time before speaking softly, "Chi-Chi, child." Tang Yu's fingers tightened. He held Tang Axian's hand tightly and placed it in his embrace. "She's cold, so she can warm up a little." Tang Axian was not afraid. Her brother was here. "If you're cold, I can hug you." Her bones were bone-piercingly cold, and it also froze his heart. A faint smile appeared on her face. She could barely make a sound, and could only use her lips to say, "Big brother, can you hug Tang Axian?" She liked her brother, but she did not dare to get close to him when she was young. Chapter 7:15. He hugged her and his body was extremely stiff. He did not move at all. After a long time, he held her with one hand and slowly pulled out the tubes with the other. His Tang Axian said that it was painful and that she did not want these things. His sister said that she wanted him to hug her. "Tang Axian, brother will carry you home." He pulled out the tubes for her and carefully helped her put on her clothes. Her previous clothes were empty and her body was so dry that she did not look like a human anymore. In his embrace, she tugged at him with her little hands. "Chi-Chi. The baby. The baby is still here." Tang Yu closed his eyes and put his face close to Tang Axian's. "Her name is Tang Tang, and her nickname is Xiaoxin. Tang Axian, you said that the 3 of us will be together forever." "I'm sorry." Tang Axian's little face was blank for a moment. "Tang Tang. Xiaoxin, Xiaoxin." She lived with her brother and Chi-Chi. Her little hand tugged at his sleeve and her eyes stared straight at Tang Yu. In fact, she knew that Chi-Chi was sick. It was Shen Lian's sister who told her. She told her that her brother chose to save Chi-Chi. She did not blame her brother because he loved Chi-Chi so much. Tang Xian's lips curled into a faint smile. Her smile was filled with happiness. No one knew that her illness acted up prematurely because she stopped taking her medicine. She did not want Chi-Chi to worry about her. Chi-Chi could not have another child. She vaguely thought that she had lived a happy life for more than 10 years, but Chi-Chi did not. She loved her brother, but she loved Chi-Chi even more. She was willing to do whatever Chi-Chi was willing to do for her. Only when she died, Chi-Chi would not be sad and take the risk of giving birth again. Brother. She loosened her little hand and immediately tightened it. She looked at him. Don't tell. She did not say the last 2 words, but Tang Yu could guess it. He carried her to the car, and the 4 black cars slowly drove away. Tang Ziyuan was also there. He quietly followed them. Even now, he could already guess, but he didn't say it. Just let Tang Xian be his daughter. Tang Xian returned to Yanhui, where she was born and raised. In the fairy tale-like princess room that Tang Ziyuan had decorated for her, she lay quietly, wearing a beautiful dress that the little maid had changed into. Her little face was ashen, and her breathing was a little hurried. Tang Yu had been sitting beside her, accompanying her, and so had Tang Ziyuan. Her little hand held Tang Yu's finger, and her other hand held Tang Ziyuan's. Her eyes slowly closed. Daddy, brother, don't cry. I'm not in pain, not at all. I was very happy. If possible, I really wanted to see Chi-Chi and Xiaoxin. She must be a very cute baby. Xiaoxin, you have to live happily for me. Tang Xian smiled, but she could no longer open her eyes. An original document was placed on her chest. It was a gift from Lin Jinrong. That was the love of the 17-year-old Tang Xian. However, she had failed someone in the end. She knew that brother Qingqing had always liked her, but she could not respond to him, not at all. She could not live for long. She did not want him to remember her. Tang Xian slowly closed her eyes. Forever. On the day she left, there was a flock of white pigeons on the top floor of Xingyuan Hospital. They kept circling above the rooftop, refusing to leave. On the grass field downstairs, Shen Chongshan was pushed outside by Mrs. Shen to bask in the sun. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.